You waited 18 years to hear my apology. The way his shoulders relaxed when I finally said the words felt like rain after a decade of drought. I stood in the marble foyer with my coat still smelling of oil and coffee, my hands shaking not from cold, but from the weight of everything I had carried. I am Clara, and this is the story of how one apology ended a long silence, how a small act on the road set off a chain that changed the balance in a room full of silver and judgment. If you like real-life turns that feel impossible at first, subscribe and tell me where you are watching from. I want to know who else carries a story like mine. 3 months before that night, I was practical to a fault. I lived in a narrow apartment above a bakery, the oven heat seeping through the floorboards, the smell of yeast and cinnamon always under my skin. My husband Louis had died 10 years earlier, and I had learned to keep careful accounts. I mended suits for neighbors, fixed kitchen taps for cash, and kept my hair in a tidy bun because neatness was armor. I had one son named Daniel who lived across town and who, for reasons I did not fully understand, had married into a family called Aldridge, a name that opened doors and closed faces. They invited me to a memorial dinner for the Aldridge Foundation and said it was a chance to meet relatives. Daniel told me it was important. I told myself it was an offer to belong. My childhood was marked by hands that taught me tools and hands that taught me patience. My father was a watchmaker named Jorge who could make an old movement sing again. He smelled of brass and lemon oil. He showed me how to balance a tiny spring and how to steady your hands when you are afraid. My mother, Elena, worked at a canteen and taught me that dignity does not need velvet. Those lessons kept me afloat when Louis got sick and when the money ran thin. I never thought my past would matter in the marble halls of the Aldridge estate, but small things follow you. A threadbare coat, a scuffed shoe, the way I pronounced names, those details make people decide if you are seen as human or as an inconvenient. The relationship between our family and the Aldridges had been complicated from the start. Daniel married Sophie quietly, almost as if bargaining for safety. The first dinner at their townhouse had been full of controlled smiles. Henry Aldridge led the table, crisp shirt, clipped laugh, eyes that measured the worth of a person like a jeweler measures a stone. Margaret Aldridge, the matriarch, sat at the head and observed rather than engaged, the kind of woman whose silence felt like a verdict. I met them once, then again at small family events, always on the margins. I remember a Thanksgiving when Sophie said, in front of many, that a person should know their place. I tried to laugh it off, but the comment landed like a stone. Conversations with Daniel turned careful, then cold. The Aldridge family had rituals, polished rules, and they kept outsiders at a polite distance. Preparation for that dinner became a study in anxiety. I chose a navy dress with a modest neckline I had saved for months to buy. I ironed it until the fabric smoothed like glass. I practiced introductions in front of my mirror. My neighbor Maria, who ran a florist shop, gave me a corsage and said quietly, "You are enough." Carlos, the mechanic who lived below, handed me a small tin of polish and said, "Don't let them see your hands tremble." Daniel called the day before and said, "Mom, be simple." He was trying to guard me, and I was trying to guard hope. I spent an afternoon asking Beatrice from the dry cleaner to steam the dress and asked Javier, the security guard at the block, to watch my building entrance in case of rain. In my bag, I folded a handkerchief and tucked in a brass stopwatch that had belonged to my father, the kind with a face worn by years of timing and glints of a lifetime that smelled faintly of lemon oil. On the way, a rain came like a curtain. The road slickened, and the radio in my old hatchback hissed. I saw a car pulled to the side, with its hood up, and a man leaning in, hands splayed, cursing softly. He was an older man, coat damp against his shoulders, a briefcase on the pavement. His shoes were scuffed, but his face had a look I could not ignore. I could have driven by and pretended business matters more than human ones. Instead, I pulled over. The catalytic object that starts the turn is small and ordinary, a frayed jumper cable tucked in the trunk that I had kept from my husband Louis' days. It had been a tool for many roadside rescues in our years of marrying repair and stubbornness. The meeting with him on the roadside was the spark. He raised his head and said, "You are kind, even if you do not look like the others." I answered, "It is cold, and brakes do not ask for permission." His name was Thomas Reed, and he carried a reputation in the city for being quietly principled. He had been a contender once, an advocate for fair housing, until a scandal chased him away into quieter work. Our exchange was simple, but full of texture. He smelled like wet fabric and tea. The jumper cable felt rough and metallic in my hands. I cleaned the battery terminals with a rag and showed him the trick my father taught me to make a battery hold a charge. I explained the procedure step by step because he'd not trust me to do it for him without knowing why. Procedure note: to connect jumper cables safely, clamp the positive clamp to the positive terminal first and the negative clamp to an unpainted metal ground away from the battery. Then start the donor car for a minute. Let the charged car run and remove clamps in reverse order while avoiding contact between clamps. Clean any corrosion on terminals with a mix of baking soda and water and a wire brush before connecting. This keeps sparks down and ensures a stable connection. We worked together, hands cold, breath visible. Thomas watched me with something that looked like recognition. When the engine turned over, he laughed an honest laugh, the kind that curved his mouth into lines that years had etched. He asked where I was going. I told him about the memorial dinner, about the Aldridges. He said, "I know that family." He said it without malice and then asked, "Do you regret the night it all began?" The question opened an old wound. I said little, and then I told a short version of an accusation I had once made in anger about a misallocated fund, a phrase I used that had branded a man who was later vindicated. I had been young with fear and quick with blame. The man who waited 18 years was the man who was wrongly blamed. He listened to me on the roadside and said, "You waited this long to tell me that, Clara. I waited to hear that you could see what you had done." At approximately 1/3 of this story, I want to ask you something. If what I told you so far touched a chord, if you have ever stopped for a stranger and found your life altered, write one line in the comments starting with "I stopped." Tell me the place and the shift. Your small sentence will help me find your voice among thousands. Many people reading this will have felt the knot in their chest when they decide whether to speak or to stay silent. If you felt that knot with me, subscribe. Being part of this community matters because your single line can be the spark in someone else's day. Now I go back to that night, to the dinner and the marble hall. When I walked into the Aldrich foyer, the smell of polish and citrus hit me, bright and sharp. Margaret Aldrich was there, hair like white silk, eyes measuring the light. Henry Aldrich greeted Daniel with a hand that was firm and cold and said, "We are pleased you could come." People in tuxedos and gowns moved like a pageant of ease. I felt conspicuous. The navy dress against chandeliers, the stopwatch heavy in my clutch, reminding me of my father's hands. My shoes clicked on marble, and I noticed Beatrice, the hostess, whispering to a waiter as I passed. My entrance rippled across the room like a pebble. Sophie smiled in that way that small girls wear the faces of their parents. I took a seat, and the evening began with speeches about legacy, about dignity and stewardship. The word dignity was repeated like a banner. The humiliation came like an unexpected current. Halfway through dinner, someone mentioned the misallocated donation from 18 years ago that had cost an outsider his reputation. A laughter ring went through the table that felt practiced. Henry, leaning back, said something about poor accounting and the necessity of proper company. A cousin named Laura laughed and said, "Some people make mistakes and some people make careers of them." The voice that cut like glass belonged to an uncle, Richard Aldridge, who had a way of making you small with a single angle of his mouth. Across the table, Thomas Reed sat rigid, and for a second there was a chance the room would not notice his color change. Then a waiter spilled red wine, and the stain on my cuff looked like a liar's signature. Someone gasped, as if my shirt were evidence. Sophie said, "You should learn the value of appearance." Daniel could not meet my eyes. My face warmed, and I felt the room contract to the size of a postage stamp. The indignity seared. The sound of cufflinks and murmured sympathy felt like salt. I could hear my own pulse and the scrape of a fork. The smell of lemon from the centerpiece seemed absurdly bright against the thudding in my ears. A neighbor, Elena, who had driven me earlier, tried to intervene with an aside that fell flat. The matriarch, Margaret, watched and did nothing. It is one thing to be poor and another to be poor with an awkward confession. My hands trembled and my tongue fumbled. In that moment, I wanted to run and hide in the bakery below and never return. The room judged with a vocabulary of small subtleties. Someone clapped, politely, for the toast, and the conversation slid on as if the stain had never happened. But for me, the evening had condensed into that strip of shame. Then Thomas stood up. He walked across the room in a way that made conversation cease and made eyes turn. He cleared his throat and he said, "I would like to say something about judgment." His voice was steady and it carried. He spoke about the danger of quick condemnations and about how people who are judged sometimes become outsiders permanently. He told the story of a night 18 years earlier when a rumor had taken a life of its own and how he had been punished for something he did not do. Then he turned to me and he said, "Clara helped me on the road tonight, and she did it without asking who I was." At that moment, Margaret Aldridge rose up from her chair, moved forward, and with a voice like a bell said, "We judge people by who they are when." No one is watching. The room shifted. Names that had been whispered were now spoken with curiosity. I felt warmth bloom where there had been cold. The defense by Thomas and the matriarch changed the tone. Henry Aldridge, who had been the center of cool power, looked as if a wind had blown through his plans. He tried to regain control with a practice line about propriety and protocol. I heard myself speaking too, in a voice that felt like glass turned into steel. I said, "I have regretted what I said 18 years ago. I did not know the whole story then, and I reacted in fear. I apologized to Thomas and to anyone I hurt." The room was quiet enough to hear silverware breathe. Beatrice, the hostess, who had been watchful and efficient, stepped forward and put a hand on my arm. She said, "Thank you for speaking." My son Daniel looked at me with eyes that had the sheen of relief and worry braided together. The night did not erase the past, but it opened a window. What happened after was something I had not expected. Margaret invited me to sit by her at the head table for dessert. She introduced me not as Daniel's mother, but as Clara George, someone who had worked for years in the community. She mentioned my father Jorge's work with watches and said his meticulous hands had taught dignity. Around me, people leaned in, asking about the little shop I kept and the repairs I made. Henry Aldridge approached and offered a curt handshake. He said, "We should all be more careful with words." It was not a full reconciliation, but it was a recognition. Thomas later pulled me aside in the library that smelled of old paper and brandy, and he said, "I waited 18 years, not for a dramatic confession, but for a simple truth. When you said you were sorry, it felt genuine." There were 3 moments of tension I will never forget, each one slowing time and forcing decisions. The first was when Sophie tightened her jaw and placed a hand on Daniel's sleeve, as if to anchor him away from me. She looked at me with eyes that were polite and sharp, and I thought for a second she would stand and declare I was unwelcome. I remembered my father's hands steadying a spring, and I breathed. The second tense moment came when Margaret stood up. I could see her fingers tremble just slightly, a human detail in a queen-like figure, and the room held its breath to see if she would condemn or defend. The third tension was my own heartbeat when I prepared to apologize to Thomas in the library. I thought of the accusation I had made years ago, of how quickly words can make a verdict. For a long minute, my memory filled with details I had tried to forget, and I had to choose whether to. Each choice felt like stepping onto a thin ice. After dessert, there was a private conversation between me and Thomas that sealed the relief I had felt on the stairs. He said, I could have sued. I could have raged. Instead, I lived with the absence of trust. When you told me you were sorry tonight, I felt something unclench inside. He then smiled, the kind of smile that had the patience of someone who had waited years for a small mercy. It was not a grand vindication, but a bridge. That smile made me weep in a way that surprised me. Margaret watched us and said, apologies are small repairs like watches. They do not replace all the parts, but they set the hands moving again. What followed in the months after changed the shape of many small lives. At 1 month, I had meetings with Margaret, who asked me to help document a community trust she wanted to start that would fund small repairs and apprenticeships for local crafts. I sat in a small office with Beatrice and Carlos, and we wrote guidelines for aid that would not humiliate recipients. The first month created 10 small grants for people who needed a startup toolkit. Daniel and Sophie negotiated things awkwardly, and Sophie began to ask about my work with an interest that was tentative but real. The project website listed a small fund named Horgie's Hands, and I watched as donors from the city gave enough to buy tools for newcomers. I felt dignity returning in the shape of work and purpose. 3 months later, I was leading an apprenticeship for young people from the neighborhood. Thomas volunteered to give talks about civic responsibility. Maria, the florist, and Elena from the bakery brought refreshments to our first graduation, where we handed out certificates and a set of tools boxed neatly. We created 5 paid apprenticeships and recorded measurable increases in people finding stable work. Henry Aldrich agreed to sponsor a scholarship for a young woman who wanted to study industrial design. The community started to see that small acts of repair could be a metaphoric and literal foundation for equal opportunity. We measured donations and hours of training. We recorded names and outcomes, and we wrote letters to funders. The ledger showed progress, and the faces in the photos showed something harder to count, a regained sense of value. 6 months in, the trust had a modest office and a small staff. We hired Carlos as a workshop manager and Beatrice as an administrator. We partnered with a local business run by Sarah Whitmore to get discounted materials. The Aldrich family had to adapt to being part of something public and messy. Margaret organized a fundraiser at the estate and invited neighborhood kids to display their work. Henry came and stood by the display of apprentices' tools and told a guest, this was her idea at first. Then it became ours. The public acknowledgement meant jobs, not charity. Thomas and I kept meeting, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for more work on civic programs. He smiled more often. Daniel and I reconnected in ways that felt less guarded. I learned that apology is not an eraser, but it is a hinge that allows doors to open. There were practical results, too. In 6 months, the trust had helped place 12 apprentices into stable employment. It had recorded 3 new partnerships with local companies, and it created a small repair scholarship that funded materials for 22 students in the next year. The scoreboard of numbers mattered because it translated dignity into livelihoods, but the quieter changes mattered more. I no longer felt like a background character in my own life. My name appeared on the donor list, not with pity, but with respect. Margaret and I wrote a short op-ed about responsibility and language in social life. In private, Henry sent a brief note acknowledging that reputation can be fragile and that institutions must guard against quick judgments. I keep my father's grass stopwatch on the desk by the window. It is not a relic of past mistakes, but a reminder of the lessons that led me to stop for a man on the roadside and to speak the truth afterwards. If you are watching this and you have a small act to tell, please write it, starting with "I stopped," so I can find your note. The community of stories here is what makes small actions enormous. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that apologies matter, that waiting can sometimes be redeemed by openness, and that dignity can be rebuilt with concrete acts. He waited 18 years to hear my apology, and when he finally smiled, I felt something like dawn. Some apologies do not erase the past, but they change the course of what comes next. If you have ever waited to be forgiven or to forgive, leave a line below. Your line may be the bridge someone else needs.